The stars above Earth flickered as massive ships tore through the fabric of space itself and arrived in humanity's home system without warning or greeting. Just sudden violent presence that made every sensor scream in alarm across the planet. Below and its orbital stations that ringed the blue marble like protective guardians. The Calthrine Dominion had arrived, and they had not come to talk Admiral. Veshkar stood on the bridge of the Dominion flagship Eternal Conquest with his four arms crossed behind his chitinous back as he watched the tactical display show the pathetic defenses of this primitive species and their laughable attempt at a space fleet that numbered, maybe, 300 vessels scattered across their system. Like toys, fire on the outer colonies first. He commanded in the clicking language of his people, and his weapons officer obeyed without hesitation because Calthrine had done this 47 times before and knew exactly how to break a species' will to fight the colony on Proxima Station. Died first when the Dominion's plasma lances carved through its shields like they were made of paper, and the station broke apart in a bloom of fire that consumed 15,000 human souls in less than 30 seconds. New Horizon went next, and the mining colony on Titan III followed shortly after, and in the span of 2 hours, humanity lost 3 of its furthest settlements and nearly 50,000 civilians, who never had a chance to run or hide or even understand what was killing. Then Veshkar watched the destruction with the cold satisfaction of a predator who knows his prey is already beaten, and he opened a communication channel that would broadcast to every human receiver in the system from Earth to the Kuiper Belt. Humans. He began, and his translated device rendered his words into their primitive tongue with perfect clarity. I am Admiral Veshkar of the Calthrine Dominion, and you have been judged unworthy of continued independent existence on Earth in the command center of the United Earth Defense Force. General Marcus Stone stood with his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the alien's transmission on the main view screen, and around him politicians and military officers stood in stunned silence as the reality of first contact turned into a nightmare. Your colonies burn as proof of our power. Veshkar continued, and behind him the tactical display showed the burning remains of human settlements. And your fleet is insufficient to resist even a fraction of our might because we are the Dominion and we have conquered worlds while your species was still learning to make fire. President Chun stood beside General Stone with her face pale, but her jaw set firm as she listened to the alien deliver what was clearly a prepared speech designed to break morale and force surrender. You have 24 of your Earth hours to transmit your unconditional surrender, Veshkar said, and his mandibles clicked in what might have been their equivalent of a satisfied smile. Failure to comply will result in the systematic destruction of your orbital infrastructure, followed by kinetic bombardment of your population centers until compliance is achieved. The transmission ended, and for a moment the command center remained silent as hundreds of people processed what they had just witnessed and the magnitude of the threat that now hung over humanity like a sword. Then, General Marcus Stone began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle deep in his chest and grew into a full, genuine laugh that echoed through the command center and made every person there turn to stare at him, like he had lost his mind under the pressure. General? President Chun asked with concern in her voice, because this was not the reaction she expected from her top military commander in the face of an extinction-level threat. Stone wiped his eyes and shook his head with a grin still on his face as he looked at the president and then at the assembled officers and politicians who watched him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright fear. They think this is our fleet, he said, and gestured at the tactical display that showed Earth's defensive satellites and the scattered patrol groups that made up humanity's visible military presence. They actually think those 300 ships and the orbital platforms are all we have. Admiral Rodriguez of the Space Navy stepped forward with her brow furrowed in confusion, because she commanded most of those visible ships and knew exactly how outgunned they were against the Calthrine's superior numbers. "Sir, with all due respect, we are severely outmatched," she said carefully, as if worried that Stone had snapped under pressure. "Their technology is at least 50 years ahead of our public fleet, and they outnumber us 3-1. Stone's grin widened, and he turned to his aide, Lieutenant Morrison, who stood nearby with a tablet in hand. "Morrison, activate Protocol Midnight Sun," Stone said clearly and loudly enough that everyone in the command center could hear him. Morrison's eyes went wide for just a moment before he saluted sharply and began entering commands into his tablet with fingers that trembled slightly from either fear or excitement. "Sir, are you certain?" Morrison asked, because Protocol Midnight Sun was something every UEDF officer knew about, but hoped would never be used. "Full activation?" "Every last asset," Stone confirmed and turned back to the President, who looked between him and the aide with growing confusion. "Madam President, I need your authorization code." "Marcus, what is Protocol Midnight Sun?" Chun asked, because while she knew the military had contingency plans, this particular one had never been briefed to her in detail. "It's our insurance policy," Stone said, and his expression turned serious for the first time since the aliens' transmission ended 200 years ago, when we first detected alien signals in deep space. "We made a decision as a species." He pulled up a new display that showed not tactical positions, but budget reports and resource allocations that stretched back decades, with numbers that made the President's eyes widen in shock. "We prepared for the worst," Stone continued, as the display showed massive expenditures hidden in mining operations and deep space exploration budgets. Every mining station in the belt, every research facility on the outer moons, every civilian shipyard beyond Jupiter. They all have a secondary purpose. President Chun stared at the numbers and felt her heart begin to race as she understood the implications of what she was seeing, because the resources diverted to these secret projects were enormous. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Since 2347, Stone replied. 196 years of preparation for the day when someone decided humanity looked like easy prey. Around the command center, those officers who knew about the protocol stood straighter while those who didn't began to understand why their general had laughed at an alien ultimatum. Stone turned to the communications officer, and his voice carried across the entire room with absolute confidence. "Send a message to Admiral Veshkar," he ordered. "Tell him that we acknowledge his ultimatum, and we have considered his generous offer of surrender very carefully." The communications officer began typing, and everyone waited to hear what Earth's response would be to an enemy that had just killed 50,000 people. "Tell him that humanity declines," Stone said, and his smile returned cold and sharp. "And give him a countdown. 72 hours until he sees what happens when you threaten human civilians." "Sir, what happens in 72 hours?" a young officer asked nervously. "The Calthrine. Learn why humans spent 2 centuries building weapons instead of utopias." Stone replied and turned to face the main view screen where the alien flagship hung in orbit like an executioner's axe. "Morrison, begin Phase 1 activation and power down all defensive satellites." "Sir, that will leave Earth completely undefended." Rodriguez protested. "No, Admiral," Stone said quietly. "It will make them think Earth is undefended, and there's a difference." The command center erupted into activity as officers moved to execute orders and activate systems that had been dormant for decades. While waiting for this exact moment, Stone's final order echoed across secure channels to every hidden installation in the Sol system. Wake up the fleet on his flagship. Admiral Veshkar received humanity's response and read it with growing confusion that turned to irritation at their defiance. "They dare refuse?" he said to his officers who clustered around the tactical display. "Very well then, and we shall teach them the price of pride." But something in the human message troubled him, and he read it again. See you in 72 hours. Why 72 hours, and what could these primitives possibly do in 3 days that would change anything? He would learn. Soon enough, and by then it would be far too late to run. Captain Jennifer Zhao floated in zero gravity inside the transport shuttle as it made its way through the Kuiper belt toward coordinates that most people in the Sol system didn't even know existed, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the activation orders that had arrived 6 hours after the Calthrine ultimatum she had served in the United Earth Defense Force for 15 years and had commanded patrol vessels and frigates. But never in her career had she imagined receiving orders like these, because they were the kind that officers whispered about in training, but never expected to actually see. Captain, we're approaching the asteroid, our pilot announced, and Zhao pushed herself forward to look through the cockpit window at what appeared to be just another unremarkable chunk of rock and ice tumbling through the darkness, except it wasn't transport. Aligned with a specific vector and broadcast an encrypted signal that was 200 years old and had been updated monthly since its creation, and the asteroid responded massive. Bay doors that had been disguised as natural surface features began to open like a mouth yawning awake after a very long sleep, and inside, Zhao could see lights flickering to life in a cavern large enough to swallow a city. Her breath caught in her throat. The UEDS Retribution sat in its hidden dock, and Zhao had never seen anything so beautiful or terrifying in her entire life, because this was not a patrol ship or a frigate, or even one of the heavy cruisers that made up Earth's visible fleet. This was a dreadnought, 2 kilometers of armor and weapons and fusion reactors that had been built in secret by crews who thought they were constructing mining equipment, and assembled by automated systems that didn't ask questions about their purpose. Holy hell! The pilot whispered, and Zhao couldn't blame him for the breach in protocol, because she felt the same awe and terror. The transport docked with the dreadnought's maintenance bay, and Zhao pulled herself through the airlock into a ship that smelled of preservatives and recycled air and the particular staleness that came from systems kept in standby for decades. But as she made her way to the bridge, she could hear the ship waking up around her with the hum of reactors coming online and computers booting from cold storage and environmental systems, beginning to circulate fresh oxygen. The bridge crew was already arriving when she got there, and Zhao recognized most of them from her previous postings, because UEDF had been quietly recruiting and training personnel for these hidden ships for years under the guise of deep space exploration programs. Captain on deck. Someone called out, but Zhao waved them off because there was no time for ceremony. Status report, she ordered as she strapped into the command chair and began reviewing the activation checklist that scrolled across her personal display. Reactors at 40% and climbing. Her chief engineer reported via comm from deep in the ship's engineering section. Weapon systems initializing and defensive grids coming online, and main drives should be ready for firing in 6 hours. 6 hours to fully wake a ship that had been sleeping for nearly 2 centuries, and Zhao felt pride swell in her chest, because humanity had built these vessels to last and to wake when called across the Sol system. Similar scenes played out in hidden installations that dotted the outer planets and their moons inside Europa's ice shell. 3 heavy carriers began flooding their hangar bays with atmosphere as fighter craft that had never seen combat powered up their engines for the first time on Titan. What appeared to be an atmospheric research station retracted its civilian facade to reveal railgun batteries, capable of accelerating projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed in the asteroid belt itself. Dozens of mining stations oriented their ore processing equipment toward new targets because those processors were designed to crack asteroids, but could also crack starship hulls with terrifying efficiency. And in orbit around Jupiter, 5 shipyards that had supposedly been building colony vessels for the past 50 years revealed that they had actually been constructing warships with the colony ship construction serving as cover for the real work happening in hidden assembly. Base General Stone watched the activation reports flood into his command center and felt satisfaction mixed with sadness, because this moment represented both humanity's greatest achievement and its greatest failure. They had achieved peace and prosperity and technological advancement, but they had never forgotten the lessons of their violent past. And so they had prepared for war while hoping it would never come status on fleet assembly. He asked Admiral Rodriguez, who had overcome her initial shock and was now coordinating the awakening with practiced efficiency. 20 dreadnoughts online within 12 hours. Rodriguez reported while scanning the incoming data. Heavy carriers deploying within 8 hours and railgun platforms already active and targeting solutions being calculated. Stone nodded and turned to the intelligence division where analysts were processing every scrap of information they could gather about the Calthrine. What are we learning about our visitors? He asked Colonel Park, who ran intelligence operations. They're intercepting our activation signals, Park reported with a grim smile. And their com traffic has increased by 400% in the last 2 hours. In translation, software suggests growing concern among their junior officers. Good, Stone said, simply because psychological warfare was half the battle, and the Calthrine needed to understand that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. A new report came in from the civilian sector, and it made Stone paused because he hadn't ordered this particular activation. Sir, we're receiving requests from civilian transport companies. Lieutenant Morrison reported with something like awe in his voice. They're volunteering their ships for military conversion. How many? Stone asked. All of them, Morrison replied. Every transport company, every mining conglomerate, every independent hauler in the system is requesting weapons packages and military software and asking for deployment orders. Stone felt his throat tighten because this was humanity at its core. And not the military preparing for war, but ordinary people who flew cargo ships and mined asteroids and transported passengers, deciding that they would rather fight than surrender. Issue the conversion packages, he ordered. But prioritize military assets, and the civilian volunteers are our reserve fleet. President Chun had been listening to all of this from her observation post, and she approached Stone with an expression that mixed pride and horror. How many ships are we activating? She asked quietly. Stone pulled up the master count and showed her the numbers that continued to climb as more hidden assets came online and more civilian volunteers registered for conversion. Current military projection: 847 warships of various classes. He said, civilian volunteers if we arm them all. Another 3,000 vessels. Chun's eyes widened because Earth's known fleet numbered 300, and the Calthrine had brought 1,200 ships to intimidate humanity into submission. We'll outnumber them 3-1. She whispered, numbers aren't everything, Stone cautioned. Their technology is superior, and their weapons are more advanced, and they have actual combat experience against other species. But Chum prompted because she could hear the confidence in his voice. But they've never fought humans. Stone finished. They've never faced an enemy that spent 200 years studying every war humans ever fought against each other and incorporating those lessons into military doctrine. On the Calthrine flagship, Admiral Veshkar was no longer quite so confident as he had been 6 hours ago. Explain to me how these primitives are activating military installations that our scouts never detected. He demanded of his intelligence officers, who huddled over their sensor displays with growing alarm. Admiral, the installations were hidden inside civilian infrastructure, one officer reported while highlighting locations on the tactical map. Mining stations, research facilities, commercial shipyards, and all of them had secondary military functions that were completely dormant until activation. Veshkar felt the first stirring of genuine concern because this level of deception suggested a military mindset far more sophisticated than their initial intelligence had indicated. How many ships are they activating? He asked. The intelligence officer hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told Veshkar everything he needed to. No, current count exceeds 900 military vessels, the officer said quietly, and there are thousands of civilian craft requesting military conversion packages. 900 ships where they had detected only 300, and the number was still climbing. Recall our scout teams, Veshkar ordered. Pull all forces back to defensive positions around the fleet and prepare for possible combat operations. His second-in-command, Commander Thelanax, approached with concern, evident in the way his antennae twitched. Admiral, perhaps we should reconsider our position. Thelanax suggested carefully. If the humans have this many hidden assets, then our initial assessment was flawed, and we may not have the overwhelming advantage we believed. Veshkar's pride rebelled at the suggestion of retreat because the Kalthrine Dominion did not flee from primitives, no matter how many ships they pulled from Haydn. 48 hours remained until General Stone's deadline, and the Sol system had transformed from a sleepy collection of civilian settlements into the most heavily armed volume of space in known history. Captain Zhao stood on the bridge of the Retribution as her crew ran combat drills and weapons tests that lit up the darkness of the Kuiper Belt with brief flashes of destructive light, and around her ship 19 other dreadnoughts were doing the same, while their crews shook off decades of simulated training to prepare for actual combat. Gunnery reports all rail cannons operational, her weapons officer, Lieutenant Chun, announced with satisfaction in his voice. We can put a tungsten penetrator through a battleship's hull from 500,000 kilometers. Good, Zhao replied while studying the tactical plot that showed not just her battle group, but the entire human fleet as it assembled into strike formations that had been planned and rehearsed in simulation. For nearly 2 centuries, the fleet was unlike anything any military theorist would recognize as proper naval organization, because it combined heavy dreadnoughts with converted mining ships that bristled with improvised weapons, and sleek carriers that launched fighters, alongside cargo haulers that had been fitted with missile racks. It was chaos, and it was beautiful on Earth. Sergeant First Class Marcus Cole stood in the armory of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Unit and checked his combat suit for the 3rd time, because attention to detail kept you alive when boarding hostile vessels in hard vacuum around him. His squad performed similar rituals with the quiet focus of professionals who knew they might be dead in 2 days, but refused to think about it too hard. Hey, Sarge, Private Williams called out while struggling with his helmet seal. Is it true we're gonna board their ships? That's the plan, Cole confirmed while helping Williams get his seal properly locked, because you didn't let your people go into combat with faulty equipment, no matter how stressed you were. Boarding actions in space, Corporal Martinez muttered while loading armor-piercing rounds into her rifle's magazine. Who the hell thought that was a good idea? Someone who studied the Kalthrine ship designs and realized they don't expect anyone to be crazy enough to try it. Cole replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The truth was that boarding enemy vessels in space was insane and dangerous, and had a casualty rate that made conventional ground warfare look safe by comparison, but it was also exactly the kind of unexpected tactic that could break an enemy's will to fight Marines. Had been training for space-boarding operations since the first combat. Simulations suggested it might be viable, and Cole had personally led more training exercises than he could count, but this would be the first time anyone tried it for real. Load up, he ordered his squad. We ship out in 6 hours, and I want full equipment checks before we board the transport. The squad moved with practiced efficiency while Cole watched them and felt the familiar mix of pride and fear that every leader felt before combat, because these were his people and he was responsible for bringing as many of them home as possible in the Calthrine fleet. Sub-Commander Krillvan stood in the intelligence center and reviewed the latest reports on human military capabilities. With growing dread, they're broadcasting music on open channels, his communications specialist reported with confusion evident in her translated voice. Battle hymns and war songs from their history. Krillvan pulled up the translations and read lyrics about standing firm against impossible odds and fighting to the last in victory or death, and he felt his chitinous skin crawl. It's psychological warfare, he said quietly. They want us to know they're not afraid. It's working, the communications specialist replied. The crew is asking questions about why these primitives seem more eager for battle than we are. Admiral Veshkar entered the intelligence center, and Krillvan immediately stood at attention, but the admiral waved him down with an irritated gesture. Report, Veshkar demanded, sir. The human fleet now numbers over 4,000 vessels, Krillvan said while pulling up the tactical display. Approximately 1,000 are purpose-built warships with capabilities that match or exceed our initial estimates, and the remainder are armed civilian craft of varying effectiveness. 4,000, Veshkar repeated flatly. Yes, sir, and they continue to activate hidden installations, and more civilian volunteers are joining every hour. Krillvan confirmed. Our numerical advantage has been completely reversed. Veshkar studied the display in silence, and Krillvan could see the calculations running behind his commander's eyes, because the admiral was proud. But he wasn't stupid. What is your assessment of their combat capability? Veshkar asked. Krillvan had been dreading this question because his honest assessment was going to sound like cowardice. Sir, based on analysis of their military history and observed capabilities, I believe we are facing an enemy that has spent 2 centuries preparing specifically for total warfare, he said, carefully. Their technology may be slightly inferior to ours, but their tactical doctrine is highly developed, and they show no indication of fear or hesitation. You're saying they might win, Veshkar said flatly. I'm saying the outcome is no longer certain, Krillvan replied. And the casualties we would sustain, even in victory, would be catastrophic. Veshkar turned away from the display, and Krillvan could see the tension in his commander's posture, because this was not how the conquest was supposed to go. The council will demand we proceed, Veshkar said quietly. Retreat now would be seen as cowardice, and my career would be over, and the Dominion's reputation would be damaged. With respect, sir, our lives matter more than reputation. Krillvan dared to say Veshkar's head snapped around, and for a moment Krillvan thought he had gone too far, but then the admiral's mandibles relaxed slightly. You're right, of course, Veshkar admitted, but I cannot order retreat without attempting battle, and if we engage and then withdraw, at least we can say we tested their strength. Krillvan wanted to argue that testing humanity's strength would get Calthrine killed, but he knew his commander had made his decision on Earth. General Stone stood in the command center and watched the fleet assembly reach its final stages with satisfaction. All combat groups report ready for operations, Admiral Rodriguez announced. We have 72 dreadnoughts, 240 heavy cruisers, 400 destroyers, 120 carriers, and approximately 3,000 armed civilian vessels in various configurations. Ammunition status? Stone asked. Sufficient for prolonged engagement, Rodriguez replied. The belt mining operations have been producing kinetic penetrators and missile warheads non-stop for the past 48 hours, and we have stockpiles that can sustain combat operations for weeks. Stone nodded and turned to the intelligence section where Colonel Park was coordinating reconnaissance. What are the Calthrine doing? Stone asked. They've pulled back into a defensive formation around their flagship, Park reported. Communication intercepts suggest disagreement among their command staff about whether to proceed with the attack. Good, Stone said. Uncertainty is what we want, and if we can make them hesitate, then we've already won half the battle. President Chun approached from her observation station, and Stone could see the weight of command on her shoulders because she was about to order humanity into its first interstellar war, Marcus. Are we ready? She asked quietly. As ready as we can be, Stone replied honestly. The Calthrine have better shields and more advanced energy weapons, but we have numbers and we have tactics they've never seen, and we have people who are willing to die to protect Earth. How many casualties are we projecting? Chun asked the question every leader dreaded. Stone pulled up the analysis that his staff had prepared and showed her numbers that made them both wince. Best case scenario if they withdraw after initial contact. Under 10,000, he said. Worst case if they fight to the end. Up to 200,000 across all services. Chun closed her eyes for a moment, and Stone knew she was thinking about the 50,000 who had already died in the colony attacks. 200,000 to save 8 billion, she said quietly. I hate this. So do I, Stone agreed. But the Calthrine made this choice when they killed our people and demanded our surrender. And now we show them what happens when you threaten humanity. The countdown timer on the main display read 36 hours throughout the fleet. Final preparations continued with an intensity born of knowing that the next time the sun rose over Earth, humanity would either still be free or would be. Learning what it meant to serve an alien empire, Captain Zhao gathered her senior officers for a final briefing and looked at faces she had trained with and served alongside and might soon die. Beside, this is what we trained for, she said simply. Every simulation, every drill, every exercise was building toward this moment, and tomorrow we find out if 200 years of preparation was enough. And if it's not? Her executive officer asked. Then we make sure it cost them everything to beat us, Zhao replied. Because even if we lose, the next species they threaten will know that humanity didn't go quietly. The meeting ended and Zhao returned to her quarters for a few hours of rest that she knew wouldn't come easily across the fleet. Millions of humans prepared for battle in their own ways with some prey. The human fleet emerged from multiple vectors simultaneously and caught the Calthrine completely by surprise because conventional military doctrine said you assembled your forces and advanced together, but humans had never been very good at following conventional wisdom. Captain Zhao watched her tactical display light up with friendly contacts as the retribution and her battle group dropped out of high-speed transit directly above the Calthrine fleet's defensive position, while 3 other dreadnought groups appeared from different angles like wolves surrounding prey, all weapons free. She ordered and felt the ship shudder as her rail cannons began hurling tungsten penetrators at a significant fraction of light speed toward enemy vessels that were still reorienting to face this multi-directional threat. The first Calthrine destroyer died before it could even raise shields, and Zhao watched it break apart under the kinetic impact of a projectile moving fast enough to punch clean through both sides of its hull. Multiple enemy contacts breaking formation. Her tactical officer reported, "They're trying to regroup, but our approach vectors have them divided." Good, Zhao said grimly. Keep firing and don't give them time to organize a proper response. Across the battle space, the human fleet's unconventional composition created chaos that the Calthrine couldn't counter with their rigid, tactical doctrine mining ships with improvised mass drivers, launched ore processing equipment converted into kinetic kill vehicles while converted. Cargo haulers ripple-fired. Missiles that swarmed toward enemy ships in numbers that overwhelmed point defense systems. The Calthrine had better shields and more advanced energy weapons, but humans had brought enough raw firepower to simply batter through superior technology. with volume and determination on the Calthrine flagship. Admiral Veshkar grabbed onto a support rail as his ship rocked from multiple impacts. Status report, he demanded while alarms wailed throughout the bridge. We're being hit from 5 different vectors, his tactical officer reported with panic creeping into his translated voice. They're using kinetic weapons that our shields weren't designed to stop, and their missile volumes exceed our point defense capacity. Return fire, Veshkar ordered. All batteries target the nearest capital ships. The Dominion fleet began to respond with plasma lances and particle beams that carved through human vessels with devastating effect because the Calthrine weapons were indeed superior, and when they hit, human ships died, but for every human ship destroyed, 3 more took its place because General Stone had planned for this and accepted that casualties would be necessary to achieve victory. Dreadnought Group 3 has lost 2 vessels. Admiral Rodriguez reported from Earth Command Center, where she coordinated the overall battle. But they've broken through the Calthrine left flank and are engaging their support ships. Good, General Stone replied while watching the tactical display that showed the battle spreading across millions of kilometers. Order carrier groups to begin fighter deployment and tell the marine transports to stand by for boarding operations. From carriers hidden among the civilian vessels, thousands of fighters launched and swarmed toward Calthrine ships like angry hornets. The fighters were smaller and more maneuverable than anything the Calthrine had brought, and they used tactics that seemed insane to the alien commanders because human pilots would deliberately fly through their own fleet's firing solutions and make attack, run so close to enemy hulls that point defense couldn't track. The sub-commander Krillvin watched fighter craft strafe his command ship and felt despair settle over him because this was nothing like the tactical simulations they had run. They fight without coordination, he said in confusion. Every ship seems to be operating independently. They call it initiative, his second officer replied while pulling up translated human military doctrine. Each commander is authorized to adapt tactics in real time without waiting for orders from higher command. Krillvin understood the implications immediately because Calthrine forces were trained to follow orders and maintain formation, but these humans were improvising and adapting faster than the Dominion could. Respond, we're going to lose, he said quietly. Captain Zhao brought the Retribution into knife-fighting range with a Calthrine heavy cruiser, and her crew worked with practiced efficiency as they poured fire into the enemy vessel. Their shields are down, Lieutenant Chen reported. Firing armor-piercing rounds, the Retribution's smaller caliber weapons sent solid slugs through the cruiser's hull, and Zhao watched secondary explosions bloom inside the enemy ship as her rounds found critical systems. Enemy vessel is venting atmosphere, Chen announced. She's dead in space. Move to next target, Zhao ordered, but before her helmsman could respond, the entire ship lurched violently and alarm screamed. We're hit, her damage control officer shouted. Plasma lance penetrated our starboard armor, and we have fires in sections 12 through 15. Zhao gripped her command chair as the ship shook and felt fear try to overwhelm her. Train, seal affected sections and vent them to space, she ordered. Engineering, I need damage assessment. Port reactor is offline, her chief engineer replied over the comm. Starboard reactor at 60%, and we've lost main engines. But maneuvering thrusters are functional. The tactical display showed a Calthrine battleship bearing down on her crippled vessel, and Zhao knew they had maybe 30 seconds before that ship's weapons recharged. All batteries target that battleship, she ordered. Fire everything we have. The Retribution might be crippled, but she wasn't dead, and her weapons blazed even as the enemy battleship opened fire on the marine transport Semper Fi. Sergeant Cole felt the ship accelerate toward the damaged Calthrine battleship that the Retribution had engaged. Listen up, he shouted to his squad over the roar of the transport's engines. That battleship is wounded. and we're going to board her through the hole that Captain Zhao just made. You mean we're going to fly into active combat and try to dock with a ship that's shooting at us?" Private Williams asked with understandable terror in his voice. "Exactly," Cole confirmed while checking his rifle one last time. "And then we're going to fight our way to their bridge and take it." The transport shuddered as point defense fire raked its hull, but the pilot kept them on course because Marine pilots were just as crazy as the Marines they carried. 30 seconds to contact. The pilot announced, "Hope you boys said your prayers." Cole activated his suit's magnetic boots and grabbed a handhold as the transport slammed into the Calthrine battleship's hull right next to the gaping wound that the Retribution had carved. "Breach! Breach! Breach!" Cole shouted, and his squad poured out of the transport into the damaged section of the enemy ship, where sparks flew and atmosphere vented and alien crew members scrambled to respond to this impossible assault. The Calthrine had never encountered boarding actions before, and their ship design reflected this with wide corridors and limited internal security because they assumed space combat was purely ship-to-ship. They learned their mistake as Marines advanced through the battleship with brutal efficiency. Cole's squad moved in a tight formation, while their training took over and they cleared compartments with the practiced movements of close quarters combat specialists who had drilled for this moment countless times. The Calthrine crew tried to resist, but they were naval personnel, not ground troops, and they had no answer for humans in powered armor carrying weapons designed to punch through bulkheads. "Bridge is 3 decks up," Cole said while consulting the ship schematics that intelligence had provided. "Martinez, take point." They fought their way through the ship deck by deck while more Marine teams boarded from other transports and spread through the vessel like a virus on the Calthrine flagship. Admiral Veshkar received reports that 5 of his capital ships had been boarded and enemy infantry was fighting inside them. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "They're boarding us during active combat?" "The humans are insane," Krillvan replied with something like awe in his voice. "They're willing to take casualties that no rational military would accept." Another report came in, and this one made Veshkar's blood run cold. "Sir, enemy forces have breached our outer hull," his security officer reported. "We're being boarded." Veshkar looked at his tactical display and saw that the battle was lost because the human fleet had broken his formations and their fighters were everywhere. And now they were boarding his ships with ground troops. "Deploy internal security forces," he ordered. "We must hold the bridge." But even as he gave the order, Veshkar knew it was futile because the humans had brought hell itself to his doorstep. Captain Zhao watched her tactical display from the crippled Retribution and saw the Calthrine fleet beginning to break apart as more ships fell to the combined assault of human weapons and boarding parties. "Captain, I'm picking up a general distress call from the Calthrine flagship," her communications officer reported. "They're requesting emergency ceasefire." Zhao looked at her ruined ship and thought about the crew members she had lost and the people who had died on the colonies and felt no mercy. "Ignore it," she ordered. "Continue firing until they actually surrender or until General Stone orders us to stop." On Earth, General Stone received the same distress call and looked at President Chen with a question in his eyes. "What do you want to do?" he asked. 7 days after the battle ended, Admiral Veshkar stood in shackles aboard a human transport that carried him to Earth, and he had plenty of time to contemplate how spectacularly the Dominion's conquest had failed. The transport docked with a Fonts with a station in Earth orbit, and Veshkar was escorted by armed guards through corridors filled with humans who stopped to stare at the alien who had threatened their world. Expected hatred in their eyes, and found it in some, but in others he saw curiosity. And in a few, he even saw something like pity, which somehow felt worse than hatred. They brought him to a conference room where General Marcus Stone waited with President Chun and several other human officials, and Veshkar was surprised when Stone gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Stone said through a translator device. "Would you like water or some other refreshment?" Veshkar's mandibles clicked in confusion because victorious conquerors did not offer refreshments to defeated enemies. "I do not understand," he said carefully while remaining standing. "Why show me courtesy after what I did to your colonies?" "Because we're not barbarians," Stone replied simply, "and because I want you to understand something important before we discuss terms." Stone pulled up a holographic display that showed the Sol system and highlighted the locations of hidden military installations and shipyards. 23 decades ago, humanity detected alien signals in deep space for the first time. Stone began. "We were excited because we weren't alone in the universe, but we were also afraid because we didn't know if the aliens would be friendly." The display shifted to show archived news footage of celebrations and protests and government debates about how to respond to the discovery. "Our leaders made a decision," Stone continued. "We would prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. And every year we diverted resources into building ships and weapons and developing contingency plans for the day when someone decided." Humanity looked weak. Veshkar listened and began to understand the magnitude of what the Dominion had encountered. "You prepared for 200 years?" he asked. 196 to be precise. Stone confirmed. "And the entire time we kept trying to make peaceful contact with any aliens we detected, but every signal we sent went unanswered." The display showed transmission logs with hundreds of attempted contacts sent to various alien signals over the decades, and Veshkar felt something cold settle in his chest. "The Dominion received your messages," he admitted quietly. "We ignored them because we do not negotiate with species we intend to conquer." "Yes, we figured that out," Stone said with dry humor, "which is why we kept building warships while publicly claiming they were mining equipment and research vessels." President Chun spoke for the first time, and her voice was firm but not cruel. "Admiral Veshkar, humanity did not want this war," she said. "We would have preferred to meet the Calthrine as friends or at least as peaceful neighbors, but you gave us no choice. I was following orders," Veshkar said, and then realized how weak that sounded. "So were the people who died on our colonies," Chun replied. "But they're still dead and their families still grieve, and someone has to answer for that." Veshkar expected her to announce his execution and found himself preparing for death with as much dignity as he could muster. Instead, Chun pulled up a document that appeared in both English and translated Calthrine. "These are our terms," she said. Veshkar read through the document and found himself increasingly confused because these were not the terms a conquering power imposed on defeated enemies. The treaty required the Calthrine to withdraw from the Sol system immediately and establish a demilitarized buffer zone of 20 light years around human territory and pay reparations for the destroyed colonies, but it did not demand Calthrine worlds or technology or submission to human authority. "You're letting us leave?" Veshkar asked in disbelief. "We're not interested in conquest," Stone said. "We just want to be left alone to develop in peace, and if the Calthrine can respect that, then we have no reason to continue hostilities." "But we killed your people," Veshkar protested, because this made no sense according to everything he understood about warfare. "Yes, and we killed far more of yours," Stone replied grimly. "The casualty count from the battle was 73,000 humans and 142,000 Calthrine. And I don't want to add to that number unless you force me to." Veshkar sat down heavily in the offered chair as the reality of the situation overwhelmed him. "You could have wiped out my fleet," he said. "Your weapons were sufficient, and your tactics were superior, and you had us completely surrounded." "We could have," Stone agreed, "but that would have meant more deaths on both sides, and for what purpose when you had already surrendered? The Dominion would have shown no such mercy," Veshkar admitted. "We're not the Dominion," Chun said quietly, "and we don't want to become like the Dominion, even if it means letting you go home to your people." Stone leaned forward, and his expression turned serious. "But make no mistake, Admiral," he said, "if the Calthrine ever threaten human territory again, we will not be so restrained, and the fleet you fought was just what we could activate in 72 hours from existing assets." "What do you mean?" Veshkar asked. Stone pulled up production reports that showed human shipyards working at maximum capacity. "We're already building more ships and developing better weapons and training more personnel," Stone explained, "because you taught us that our 200-year preparation wasn't quite enough. The next fleet that threatens Earth won't face 4,000 ships." Admiral Rodriguez added from her position at the conference table. "They'll face 10,000 or 20,000 or however many we decide we need to guarantee our safety." Veshkar understood the implication and felt fear settle into his bones, because humanity had just demonstrated what they could do when threatened, and now they were doubling down on military development. "You want me to carry a message back to the Dominion," he said. "We want you to carry a message to every species in the galaxy," Chun corrected. "Humanity seeks peace, and we will gladly trade and share knowledge and work together toward mutual prosperity. But if anyone threatens us again," Stone finished, "they'll learn the same lesson you just did at a much higher cost." The conference continued for hours as they worked through the details of the treaty and reparations and the buffer zone that would separate human and Calthrine space. Veshkar found himself actually negotiating with humans who listened to his concerns and made reasonable compromises where possible while remaining firm on their core demands. It was nothing like Dominion conquest protocols, which simply dictated terms to defeated enemies. "Why are you being so reasonable?" he finally asked when they took a break in the negotiations. Stone considered the question while sipping coffee from a ceramic mug. "Because war is easier than peace," he said after a moment. "Any fool can destroy, but it takes wisdom to build, and we'd rather build a galaxy where humans and Calthrine can coexist than one where we're constantly fighting each other. The Dominion Council will not see it that way," Veshkar warned. "They will view your mercy as weakness, and some will argue for a second invasion with overwhelming force." "Let them try," Stone said calmly. "We'll be ready, and the next time we won't wait for you to attack our colonies before we respond." Veshkar believed him because he had seen what happened when humans were pushed to the final stand 3 days later. The Calthrine fleet prepared to depart the Sol system under escort by human warships that would ensure they actually left. Admiral Veshkar stood on his flagship's bridge, which had been repaired just enough to make the journey home, and watched Earth grows smaller on the view screen. "Admiral, the human General Stone is requesting a final communication," his communications officer reported. Veshkar accepted the call, and Stone's face appeared on the screen. "Safe travels, Admiral," Stone said, "and remember our agreement." "I will never forget," Veshkar replied honestly. "The Dominion made a grave error in judgment, and your people have taught us a lesson we will carry for generations." "Good," Stone said, "and Admiral, for what it's worth, I'm glad we can end this with talking instead of more fighting." "As am I," Veshkar admitted. "Your species is remarkable, General Stone, and terrifying in equal measure." "We're just humans," Stone replied with a slight smile. "We learned a long time ago that the universe is a dangerous place, and the only way to survive is to be more dangerous than the threats we face." The communication ended, and the Calthrine fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives and vanished from human space on Earth. General Stone stood on the observation deck of the orbital command station and watched the alien ships disappear. A young officer approached and stood beside him in silence for a moment before speaking. "Sir, do you really think they'll honor the treaty?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. "I think they'll try," Stone replied. "And if they don't, then we'll be ready, because we're already building the next generation of ships and training the next generation of soldiers. Will we ever get to live in peace?" Morrison asked quietly. Stone thought about the question and about the 200 years humanity had spent preparing for war while hoping for peace. Maybe, he said finally. But not in our lifetime, and probably not in our children's lifetime, because the universe just taught us that there are species out there who see humanity as prey.